Good evening, or good afternoon, or good day, friends. Conversations with Ina and Martin, C.J. Jung's Aion, researchers into the phenomenology of the self. Chapter
Mhm.
5, Christ, a symbol of the self. Welcome, Ina. How are you doing, my dear? It's always so fun to get to meet online like this.
Exactly. Definitely looking forward to our recording today and what we can bring and what will show up for us. Yeah, it's an interesting chapter, not easy for everyone to grasp, definitely.
It's taken us about a month to do the studies, and we've been kind of living through it, in our own processes, so that we can, I think, offer some really good insight to our viewers. Of course,
Correct.
of course, this is all about our viewers, and so we want to thank you for tuning in. There's about 40
Mhm.
or 50 of you that have watched every episode, and so thank you for supporting us. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for becoming subscribers to the channel. And again, we really appreciate your questions. So let's maybe do a bit of retrospect of where we've been so far. Uh,
Sure, sure.
you want to get us started?
Well, we started with a blind ego that is always self-absorbed and doesn't know what's right and wrong and always sorts being a good girl or being a good boy and trying to please mommy and daddy all the time, lost in its own path kind of thing.
Mhm.
And Jung always called us towards finding looking at the world that we experience as a not as just a story, or being swept by a story, but actually be able to reflect and see what is this that you're experiencing mirroring to you about you, and that have the into the work. Then the next chapter was uh, the chapter of
The
the
shadow.
shadow, where I think that we none of this work. I Even though it's not I would say it is a significant chapter, but I think it's a chapter that gives us a sort of an obvious. Of course, we're going to be doing those shadow work. Of course, we're going to be working on the shadow through. It doesn't matter which archetype we address, but at the same time, um, shadow is the most important chapter because it tells us how to do it and what to do it. What to do with it through every chapter in our process. Then we moved into synergy between the masculine and the feminine. Um,
The Sizigi, the anima and the
the
animus.
syzygy, yeah, of the anima and animus, where are represented of the feminine and masculine within our psyche. Never an easy chapter for me personally because I think, in my personal opinion, and I think most people tend to understand it as a gender and genderize it when they're trying to grasp and understand the anima and animus. And I think it's misleading in many ways because that is not what it's about. And perhaps yes, in the dreams it will still show up as a man and a woman, but gender has nothing to do with it. It's how our psyche and environment and the community of our psyche and how is it responses to those energies. And now we have come to the Christ. No, first we had the self, right?
Right, right.
Then I read the chapter on the self.
Well, the first four chapters are basically a review of the basic concepts of Jungian psychology.
Correct. Hmm.
With and then with chapter 5, then what happens is that then Jung looked at the mythology and the symbolism behind the Christian archetype. And
Hmm.
this is his thesis, really, the Christian, myth of this, self in
Hmm.
the process of individuation. this myth being the myth of that overrides or informs the age of
Mhm.
Pisces.
Mhm.
And so then this is the beginning. The first four chapter kind of set the scene, and then in the chapter five, then it becomes really mythological
Correct. Correct.
about what's going on. And then after, in subsequent chapters, he gets much more astrological. And then again, we're looking at a thesis from Jung that really marks a great departure or
Mhm.
breakthrough in his work. Aion sets the tone for the later work. His alchemical work, his Gnostic work,
Mhm.
his mystical work, is in-depth analysis of the collective psychosis.
Mhm.
Volume 9 part 2 is kind of like the breaking point between the basic beginning work, the first 9 volumes, to volume 10 and to volume 18, which really are next level Jung. So that this book is like right in between, and it really sets philosophically, this new dimension that
Hmm.
Jung is arriving at in his work.
Absolutely. And especially as we get into this fifth chapter, it is incredibly important to understand that he still, even though he uses the example of the Christ, he still speaks about our psyche. He still how it shows up in our psyche and how it manifests within us and creates the world that we're experiencing. This is one of, and the other thing that I'd like to point out to our viewers is that it is incredibly important either to read in slow motions the slides or reach out to Martin to send you the slides. Once you read Jung's work, the medicine of his writing does its own work on your own psyche, and it will give you, and it will uplift things for you that you need to pay attention and do its power and do its job.
Yeah, you can't just casually read Jung. It's
No.
just like us. We've been working on this chapter, and through the whole process of studying the chapter, we've been moved to breakthroughs in our own personal
Amen.
work.
Amen.
And so it's like
Absolutely.
working with Jung. Jung becomes kind of an active participant in your
Hmm.
psychological process.
Absolutely.
It's wonderful to witness, and I'm not
Hmm.
the only one. I mean, I think all of us who study Jung with any kind of sincerity have this experience.
Hmm.
So let's dive into it here and see what Jung has to say about this process. So here we are. Why, my reader will ask, do I discourse upon Christ and his adversary, the Antichrist? Our discourse necessarily brings us to Christ because he is the still living myth of our culture. He is our cultural hero who,
Hmm.
regardless of his historical existence, embodies the myth of the divine primordial man, the mystic Adam. It is he who occupies the center of the Christian mandala. These make the psychological position of the Christ symbol quite clear. Christ exemplifies the archetype of the self. He represents a totality of a divine or heavenly kind, a glorified man, a son of God, unspotted by sin. So so that's like the beginning of the chapter. He says, okay, this is the living myth of our time. And as he goes on in this thesis, he explains, in the next chapter about the age of Pisces and how this myth of the Christ and the Antichrist, or the the God principle of Adam, the mystic Adam, the primordial man, the Gnostic called him the anthropos, the perfect man. And so, and that perfect man being a bisexual nature, connecting with anima and animus within himself, so that's this syzygy, or this concept of the perfect man. Christ is the prototype and the biggest example in our culture of this transformation. And for those who are interested in the subject matter, there's a great favor that you must do yourself, and that is to read Jung's The Answer to Job. The Answer to Job is a Judeo-Christian thesis on what happened between the Jewish reality of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and what the prayers and the story of Job has to say about this evolution of the God principle, where God became man. That is foundational to the ideas, and that one little book, Answer to Job, made such a huge splash in the Christian world, both positively and negatively. And there's all kinds of beautiful stories about that. And all of that is in volume 10 of the collected work. No, volume 11, Psychology and Religion. Fabulous, fabulous work. But I digress here. Let's get back to the material. Uh,
It's okay. We all want to be Christ-like.
in service to something greater than us, for sure.
Amen. Amen.
And so here we go. So the God image in man was not destroyed by the fall, but it was only damaged and corrupted, deformed, and can be restored through God's grace. So just to, so the Christian mythology, so this God image in man, which was Adam, was not destroyed by the fall. The fall is when Adam and Eve were kicked out of heaven. So that's the fall.
Mm-hmm.
So, but only damaged or corrupted, and can be restored through God's grace. The scope of this integration is suggested by the descensus ad inferos, the descent into hell. And so the myth of Christianity and Christ's soul going down to hell is also exemplified in alchemy as the descent into hell, or the journey down to hell, or what is called the dark night of the soul. And so in that sense, Christ's journey is it's the mythological conception of the process of individuation. It's a real example of what happens, and we've experienced it ourselves. This descensus ad inferos, the descent into hell. Whew, the descent of Christ's soul to hell. Its working of redemption, embracing even the dead. The psychological equivalent of this is the integration of the collective unconscious, which forms an essential part of the individuation process. So that's a lot right there, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's this integration of the collective unconscious that we go through in the process of individuation is mirrored
Exactly.
by the process that Christ went through. So,
Mhm.
so again, this myth of Christianity is the symbolization, the most apt symbolization of the process of individuation Jung found. Mm.
Mhm.
And then he gets into the privatio boni. Thanks to the doctrine of the privatio boni, wholeness seems guaranteed to the figure of Christ. One must, however, take evil rather more substantially when one meets it on the plane of empirical psychology. There it is simply the opposite of good. In the ancient world, the Gnostics, whose arguments were very much more influenced by psychic experience, tackled the problem of evil on a broader basis than the church fathers. So what's your understanding of that privatio boni?
Not much. You're gonna have to extrapolate, but I definitely can relate that through the suffering doing the work, the pressure cooker that is created while we're doing our continue with our work, definitely helps with the integration and expansion and redemption.
The
This is
privatio
not just words for me. It's actually something that I've embodied and experienced, and that leads to my own personal growth of my psyche.
Right, right. The Privatio Boni came out of the early church fathers as a reaction to what the Gnostics were saying about the archon and the archetype of the devil being a unity with the archetype of Christ. So in
Mhm.
early Christianity, they were known as brothers. And so then the privatio boni was an argument the early church fathers came up with to say that the devil did not exist.
Mm,
Evil is only the absence of good.
mm,
And in that sense, they've devalued evil.
mm,
And so it is what we do in our own process when we value the ego too much and we devalue the shadow.
mhm,
So then, so Jung looks at that as being the main illusion of the Christian era is that this illusion of the privatio boni, to ignore, to give no substance to evil, actually creates the enantodromia, creates the perfect situation for evil to rise up as the Antichrist and to possess the Christian ideal. And
mhm.
so, from our perspective, from modern perspective, we look at all the awful things Christianity did. And Jung says that that's a result of the privatio boni and the refusal to see that every one of us has evil within us. And that's what Christianity did. They thought they were above
Mhm,
evil,
mhm,
and then they did
mhm,
all kinds of evil things. That's the law of nature called an enantodromia, that secretly you become that which you hate, or that secretly you become evil, or whatever you're fighting, you become that you're fighting. So the crusades and all of the different craziness
mhm,
that
mhm.
happened in Christianity were a manifestation of the very evil within their soul that they were projecting on, whether it was the witches or the infidels.
Whatever they expelled,
Mhm,
or demonized it and said that does not belong here because it's bad in our perception, still came hunting down,
absolutely, absolutely.
came knocking on the door.
Well, this is what this whole chapter is about, is
Mhm.
coming to point to understand what evil is. So here we are. So in making these statements, we are keeping entirely within the sphere of Christian psychology and symbolism. A factor no one has reckoned with, however, is the fatality inherent in the Christian disposition itself, which leads inevitably to a reversal of its spirit, not through the obscure workings of chance, but in accordance with psychological law. And that psychological law is the enantodromia, and then Jung explains it at the last of the chapter in a really beautiful quote that's been passed around a lot. So the ideal of spiritual striving for the heights was doomed to clash with the materialistic, earthbound passion to conquer matter and master the world. This change became visible at the time of the Renaissance. The word means rebirth, and it referred to the renewal of the antique spirit. We know today that the spirit was chiefly a mask. It was not the spirit of antiquity that was reborn, but the spirit of medieval Christianity that underwent strange pagan transformation, exchanging the heavenly goal for an earthly one. Well, this is key to Jung's work, is to understanding the evolution of the Christian era. And again, we look at the 2000 years of the age of Pisces, and in further chapters we're going to look at it differently. But this confrontation of Christ and Antichrist, and this shift of Christianity, where Christianity became really a religion of materialism, which was really completely, it was born in the shadow of the Roman Empire, and spoke of the small people and of living life for transcendence and for the other world. And then in 1,000 years, it got shifted to conquering the material, the world. And this Christian spirit shifted into an anti-Christian spirit, into the Antichrist. And at that time, you had so many people who, religious sects, Jung gets into it in his studies, especially in religion and psychology and religion. He talks about the Cathars and all the different movements who believed really that the world was created by the devil, and that it was actually run by the devil. And so that's why these sects got ostracized and gradually rooted out. And so, now we look at that great schism that happened around the 14th and 15th century, and the Renaissance, which was followed by the Reformation, and then all of this incredible schism that created a split into Christianity. And Jung again gets into it a lot more. Did all that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. You forgot to mention politics beside the materialism, but that's just beside the point. We're not going to get into that.
Well, the politics, are just a reflection of that, absolutely. And
100%.
if we got into the politics, we would never end the video.
Indeed.
So then the next slide is very interesting. So then Jung says, the subsequent development that led to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution have produced a world situation today which can only be called anti-Christian, in the sense that confirms the early anticipation of the end of time. You know what that word, that end of time is?
No.
It's the end of time is the myth of the apocalypse. The
Okay. Mhm.
the apocalypse is it's a Christian prophecy of the end of time. So that's a very popular word nowadays, apocalypse, and it means the end of time. And it is a Christian concept. And it's, prophesized in the Bible, and the anti-Christian, and then the Enlightenment, or the rise of rationalism and scientific, which the French Revolution was the biggest symbol of. In Notre Dame, they replaced Maria with the goddess of reason, and they had a parade, and they brought the goddess of reason and enshrined it into Notre Dame during the French Revolution. And Jung looked at that as the beginning of the Enlightenment, and this the beginning of this apocalyptic Christian anticipation of the world, and then we've been living through these times ever since that. So that's what's fascinating about Jung's work, is he gives us an historical perspective of the evolution of the human spirit through the Christian era, which is a study really of the age of Pisces, from from an astrological perspective, it's fascinating. So, end of time, it is as if with the coming of Christ, opposites that were latent till then had become manifest, or as if a pendulum had swung violently to one side and were now carrying out the complementary movement in the opposite direction. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell.
This is my favorite sentence out of this whole chapter.
Well, that and then the last quote as well. But
Yes, 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 yes,
no
yes.
tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its root reach down to hell. And what that means is that in that Christian enantodromia, this law of psychology that Jung talks about, is that if we glorify one side of the personality too much without
Exactly.
looking at the shadow, then the shadow ends up possessing one. And
Mm-hmm.
so then the honoring of heaven and hell within our own soul.
Mm-hmm.
Just as we have to remember the gods of antiquity in order to appreciate the psychological value of the animus archetype,
Mm-hmm.
so Christ is our nearest analogy of the self and its meaning. Looked at from the psychological angle, he corresponds to only one half of the archetype. The other half appears in the Antichrist. The later is just as much a manifestation of the self, except that he consists of its dark aspect. Both are Christian symbols, and they have the same meaning as the image of the Savior crucified between two thieves. This great symbol tells us that the progressive development and differentiation of consciousness leads to an ever more menacing awareness of the conflict and involves nothing less than crucifixion of the ego, its agonizing suspension between irreconcilable opposites.
Beautiful.
Well, what that means, and we know we've been working together for quite a while now, and we've been experiencing this conflict of opposites within your nature and within mine as
Absolutely.
well. And so then the living myth of Christianity, this suspension on the cross, is one that all of us has to live through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How's
Well,
that been going for you?
because there is a light and a dark in all of us, right? And without the darkness, we cannot see the light. The light must emerge through the darkness, no matter how much idealistic or how perfect it sounds. It's the truth.
Well,
We do need to be broken down, rolling in fever, broken relationships in order for the light to emerge and actually to have this true aha moment where walls comes down.
and then Jung talks about the personality, and how the personality is very shallow if it hasn't integrated the shadow. There's no
Hmm.
there's no substance to the personality. It's just the privatio boni. It's just
Hmm.
that dreamy Christianity that
Hmm.
hasn't
Hmm.
faced the devil.
Idealistic. Hmm. Hmm.
Hmm, completely. There's no substance to it.
Hmm.
Okay, so where you go, inconcilable opposites. Boom. Okay. Naturally, there can be no question of a total extinction of the ego. And this is what we talked about before. This is really beautiful. For then the focus of
I think this is one of the things you kept telling me over and over and over and over and over at the beginning. You were telling me, what are you doing? It's beautiful. Your ego is beautiful.
well, the ego, but then the focus of consciousness would be destroyed if the ego was destroyed.
Hmm.
The result would be complete unconsciousness. The relative abolition of the ego affects only those supreme and ultimate decisions which confront us in situations where there are insoluble conflict of duty. This means, in other words, that in such cases, the ego is a suffering bystander who decides nothing but must submit to a decision and surrender unconditionally.
Mm-hmm.
The genius of man, the higher and more spacious part of him whose extent no one knows, as the final word, that's the self. It
Mm-hmm.
is therefore well to examine carefully the psychological aspects of the individuation process in the light of Christian tradition, which can describe it for us with an exactness and impressiveness far surpassing our feeble attempts, even though the Christian image of the self Christ lacks the shadow that properly belongs to it.
A
That
lot of
was,
obstacles.
what's that?
A lot of obstacles, but great reward.
Well, the obstacles are also kind of the process of integration, this confrontation of opposites. It's later on in Jung's work, in the middle volumes there, in the second half, the alchemical work, Jung symbolizes this in terms of the sacred marriage of the anima and the animus in his alchemical work, the Mysterium Conjunctionis, the mystery of the conjunction. So then this is kind of, like I said earlier, this is the beginning of the study of what the confrontation of opposite really means. And so this confrontation of opposites, it's a battle to the death in a sense, and so we experience that crucifixion between the two sides of our nature. And at a particular point we must have an acceptance that there's a process that the ego does not understand, and that it simply needs to surrender to the higher self. And so that process is an essential part of the individuation process, and again it's symbolized by the Christian myth. How did that feel?
I'm just laughing because that's exactly what happened this weekend. And you and I just finished talking about it.
It's kind of like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so and then we go to the next slide. Okay. Psychology does not know what good and evil are in themselves. It knows them only as judgments about relationships. Good is what seems suitable, acceptable, or valuable from a certain point of view. Evil is its opposite. It is evident that psychology is concerned with a more or less subjective judgment. There are things from which a certain point of view are extremely evil, that is to say, dangerous. There are also things in human nature which are very dangerous and which therefore seems proportionally evil to anyone standing in their line of fire. It is pointless to gloss over evil things, because that only lulls one into a sense of false security. Human nature is capable of an infinite amount of evil, and the evil deeds are as real as the good ones, so far as human experience goes, and so far as the psyche judges and differentiates between them. Only unconsciousness makes no difference between good and evil. Inside the psychological realm, one honestly does not know which of them predominates in the world. No amount of insight into the reality and fallibility of our moral judgment, relativity and fallibility of our moral judgment can deliver us from these defects. And those who deem themselves beyond good and evil are usually the worst tormentors of mankind, because they are twisted with the pain and fear of their own sickness. Um,
That's a that's a powerhouse of a slide. That is truly a powerhouse. Wow.
what insight?
It's I'm gonna have to say that this is the most sort of accessible for the ego. This slide is the most accessible language for the ego to process, and for
Hmm.
one to reflect and say, okay, when I get way too much into the judgment, I call it when I get way too much in the story that is unfolding in front of me, whether I'm being called out to be a friend or I'm being called out to be into a fight with someone, if I'm gonna get into it mindlessly and be swept by a story, then I will be swarming in the judgment and in all of that that is arising, and try to sort it out and figure it out, who was right, who was wrong, who is bad, who is evil, who's good, who's bad, and to stay sort of rise up above it, and notice when things get triggered within you, and notice how what is really showing up for you right now, rather than being engaging in what is arising in front of you right now, but actually staying a reflective point, has served me personally greatly, and I'm sure it's the same for you, right?
Well, it's the ability to realize that each and every one of us has evil within us, and that
Exactly.
is usually projected on someone else, and then we
Exactly.
usually enter into conflict with our
Hmm.
own shadow through other relationships.
Hmm.
And so then Jung says that there's nothing that promotes intimacy more than the withdrawal of projection. To
Hmm.
be able to own up to the fact that the evil that I see in others is within me. And that
Exactly.
that is really an ultimate issue, a main part of the act of redemption in the Christian doctrine, is to be able to see that evil is within me and I need to do something about it.
Well, wasn't this Christ saying in one of the scriptures that don't judge, um, don't judge the other unless you have nothing to be judged for, kind of thing?
What
I
is
think
it?
it was.
Don't look at the little splinter in your neighbor's eye when you have a whole beam in your own.
Exactly.
It
Exactly.
goes that something like that, huh?
Exactly. Exactly.
So here we go. We're going on to the next slide. This has been exciting. Whoops. Come on. Here we go. Today, as never before, it is important that human beings should not overlook the danger of the evil lurking within them. It is
Mm.
unfortunately only too real, which is why psychology must insist on the reality of evil and must reject any definition that regards it as insignificant or actually non existent. Psychology is an empirical science and deals with realities. As a psychologist, therefore, I have neither the inclination or the competence to mix myself up with metaphysics. Only I have to become polemical when metaphysics encroaches on experience and interprets it in a way that is not justified empirically. And so this is really important. Jung, makes the point that he's a scientist, not a spiritual leader.
That's right. That's right. Yes, he keeps underlining this all the time.
All the time. And he
Yeah.
says this is only about, psychology. And so, and then he says something really beautiful, which, is kind of at the root of his thesis here is the devil, like the Gnostic archons, dwells in the firmament, and he and his angels presumably correspond to astrological gods and influences. So, throughout this thesis, Jung brings more and more into focus the era of the fishes, the age of Pisces, and the mythology of Christianity and the Christ and the Antichrist as being the two fishes in the symbolism of the fish of astrology. And then, he goes further and he says, well, these things, that we study, they're all part of astrology. And so
Mhm.
throughout Jung's work, you'll always find allusions and evidence of the importance of psychological, astrological ideas to Jungian psychology. And that's why, as an astrologer, I'm so fascinated with Jung's work, because he adds a foundation to our astrological work that really no one else gives us, really.
Indeed.
Fascinating stuff. How we doing?
Well, how many more slides do we have?
We have about 5 more slides.
All right, let's keep going.
We are indeed. Um, so, boom. So then, this is a simple and easy slide. We get a little break. I have gone into the doctrine of the privatio boni at such length because it is, in a sense, responsible for a too optimistic conception of the evil in human nature and for a too pessimistic view of the human soul. Boom. So, so in that sense, Jung, because really we look at what's happened to our religion, and our spiritual engagements in the modern time, and we look at new age, and we look at the angels, and we look at, praying to my angels and my guidance, and all of the anthroposophical and theosophical conceptions of spirituality, which are really basically rehashing of the Christian myth in a more modern way, which really still looks um, only to the light of human nature, and not to the darkness of the human soul, and so facing the shadow and integrating. By not doing that, then we actually empower evil, so that even though we have this idea that, we're evolving, we're actually turning a blind eye to the evil of our times, and kind of sublimating through our practice, while not really facing the facts that we are in a very, very grave danger of having to face our own evil through repeated crisis of incredible proportions, and it just mirrors our dissociation, and the failure.
But if we're not taught how to reflect properly from a young age, right? If our parents did not have access to this union wisdom of the psyche while we were developing as children, if in school we're not being called to develop a healthy self where the acceptance of um, of the self and helping building good qualities for the self and a healthy ego, or at least if educationally we would be just simply brought up in how to manifest and how to develop a healthy ego within the child. Of course this whole concept would be completely different, right? But we've gone centuries now.
Absolutely, absolutely, completely agree with you that ultimately it is a crisis in our education, and
Hmm.
and that has been going on ever since the Enlightenment. There's been a devalorization of any kind of spirituality as being
Hmm.
unscientific, and it's
Hmm.
come to a point now where we have empowered science so much that
Hmm.
everyone is a ticking time bomb of neurosis and psychosis, where mental
Hmm.
health has become an epidemic, which is really
Hmm.
spiritual health. So
Hmm.
so
And tarot and astrology, intuition, all of that was demonized as something that is a voodoo.
and at the same time, at no other time in history has these, practices been more strong, because they compensate this
Exactly.
this lack of education. And so really here we are now in the territory of understanding the transition between the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius, which
Exactly.
will be subject of our next videos. Now that's fascinating. So let's see, what else do we got going here? I pressed the wrong button.
It's okay.
Don't, don't you love that? Technology. It's if you don't press the wrong, if you press the wrong button, you'll get a wrong result. So then we have three more slides, and here, Jung really gets into it. And so the Christ image fully corresponds to the situation. Christ is the perfect man who is crucified. One could hardly think of a truer picture of the goal of ethical endeavor. At any rate, the transcendental idea of the self that serves psychology as a working hypothesis can never match the image, because although it is a symbol, it lacks the character of a revelatory historical event. That's why the Christian myth is so important, because it was a revelatory historical event, just like the birth of Buddha and Mohammed. There are revelatory historical events which add to the power of the myth. Mm. Like the related ideas of Atman and Tao in the East, the idea of the self is at least in part a product of cognition, grounded neither on faith nor on metaphysical speculation, but on the experience that under certain conditions, the unconscious spontaneously brings forth an archetypal symbol of wholeness. From this, we must conclude that some such archetype occurs universally and is endowed with a certain luminosity. And there is, in fact, any amount of historical evidence as well as modern case material to prove this. So this is, what this is, an empirical study, and that's what Jung does, is he gives an empirical scientific basis to these ideas, so much so that psychology becomes the science of the soul.
Mhm.
So, and there's any amount of historical as well as case material to prove this. These naive and completely uninfluenced pictorial representation of the symbol show that it is given central and supreme importance precisely because it stands for the conjunctions of opposites. Naturally, the conjunction can only be understood as a paradox, since a union of opposite can be thought of only as their annihilation. Paradox is a characteristic of all transcendental situations because it alone gives adequate expression to their indescribable nature. Wow, huh?
Not for the faint of heart, that's for sure.
Yes, not for the faint of heart. It's really significant, though, that Jung uses, excuse me, uses this incredible insight into the Christian myth. Jung was born, his father was a minister, and his mother was kind of a witch-like individual who, talked to ghosts and had visions in her dreams. So we had kind of a pagan, archaic mother and a conflicted Christian soul. And so that's what he was born in, and his early dreams and visions were filled with these images. And so he came to these studies as a way of resolving his own conflict with his own psyche. And so then he explains Christianity from that perspective, from that symbolic viewpoint, which then becomes the living myth of this process of individuation. And so then it really reconciles this age of Pisces and the conflicts that were born of it, and explains it in a rational and scientific way to so much sense that we can reconcile. Because my grandmother was a deeply devout Catholic, and I learned to pray from her, and by studying Jung, and I realized that really we are on the same path, even though I went in a different direction. And so then it helped me recognize this ancestral quest for redemption that inhabits our ancestral lines.
Correct.
And I know you're going through that as well.
I am.
Fascinating how the essay just completely mirrors what we're going through, huh?
Well, wasn't it Jung who talked about synchronicity?
We did. Okay, 2 more slides. We're doing good. You guys have been doing great. So whenever the archetype of the self predominates, the indivisible psychological consequence is a state of conflict vividly exemplified by the Christian symbol of crucifixion, that acute state of unredeemedness, which comes to an end only with the words consummatum est, like the end. You become consumption, or what the alchemists called the negretto, the burning up, the journey into hell, the dark night of the soul. You become consumed by that crucifixion, which is really a very popular symbolism in what happens in the more difficult parts of individuation. Recognition of the archetype, therefore, does not in any way circumvent the Christian mystery. Rather, it forcibly creates the psychological preconditions without which redemption would appear meaningless. And this word redemption, I can't tell you how often this theme comes back in my astrological work with individuals, that the quest for redemption is a real destiny in all of us. And so in that sense, the myth of Christianity reveals itself in our most intimate struggles and conflicts. So redemption does not mean that a burden is taken from one's shoulder which one is never meant to bear. This is also one of my favorite little sayings here. Only the complete person knows how unbearable man is to himself.
Indeed.
Only the complete person knows how unbearable man is to himself. So far as I can see, no relevant objection can be raised from the Christian point of view against anyone accepting the task of individuation imposed upon us by nature, and the recognition of a wholeness or completeness as a binding personal commitment. If he does this consciously and intentionally, he avoids all the unhappy consequences of repressed individuation. In other words, if he voluntarily takes the burden of completeness on himself, he need not find it happening to him against his will in a negative form. This is as much as to say that anyone who is destined to descend into a deep pit had better set about it with all necessary precautions rather than risk falling into the hole backwards. It's that same thing as being dragged by the Great Mother or going willingly,
Exactly. That's exactly what I thought. Yes. There is a reason for this work. Don't stop. Keep going. Trust me, this is a better way.
Well, just going willingly instead of just like, falling behind,
Sure.
falling backwards into the.
Absolutely. And by going willingly, we become active participant. By
Mhm.
going willingly, we actually, by becoming active participant, we get the hell out of the way. We let it speak whatever does need to come up and speak, whether
Beautiful.
it's through writing, whether it's through painting, whether it's through you name it, in any form or shape. But becoming an active participant and watching your dreams and doing the work, perhaps tedious and annoying, but it is much better to be walking into with eyes open rather than being tumbled backwards, like he said.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have two little quotes that we really like. One is no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots extend to hell.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the other one that we just read?
A complete human, right?
Only the complete, only the complete person knows how unbearable man is to himself.
Exactly.
Okay, and then we come to the last slide and our last. So without us stopping to discuss the question of whether this exacerbation of the opposites, much as it increases suffering, may not after all correspond to a higher degree of truth. I should like merely to express the hope that the present world situation may be looked upon in the light of the psychological rule alluded to above.
Mm-hmm.
Today, humanity as never before is split into two apparently irreconcilable halves. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves.
Amen.
Now, and so that's a lot.
Just he just described a definition of a shadow in the mirroring.
And if we don't face the inner darkness, then it rises up against us and haunts us in the outside.
Absolutely. It will create a story that you will experience, and you will think your boss is evil, or your parents are evil, or your children are not fair, or whichever ever, the chessboard will look like, but all it's doing, it's like manifesting and actually showing you what's happening on your inner side, on inside.
And usually, whatever we accuse the other of doing, we're guilty of ourselves.
Exactly. Exactly.
and and
Exactly.
and that's that beam in the other the little mote in the other person's eye. Well, I have a beam in my own, and so to be able to, and so I think that this chapter is so important in that it gives a mythological and alchemical and even astrological form to what we studied in the first four chapters, to the point where now the thesis, Jung's thesis, is about to evolve now into a study of the symbolism of the fish and the age of Pisces, and this introduction to this concept of the age of Aquarius, of which Jung had a tremendous amount to offer. And so we're at a very interesting point in this discussion on Aion, the phenomenology of the self. I hope you've
And
been
how
enjoying
important it
this.
is,
What was that? Sorry.
and how important it is at this time as we are marching into the age of Aquarius, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. It adds a great validity to Jung's work. And I feel a lot of times when I'm reading Jung that Jung's work is more relevant now than ever before.
Mhm,
He
mhm,
seemed to have been preparing us for these great changes.
mhm, mhm.
And we'll talk about that more as we go along. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Ina, for joining me in this great adventure.
From heart to heart, I'm sending love. Thank you.
And so let's sign out slowly here. We're going to let people know who we are, and we know who we are. And you're Ina, and your website is divineu.ca. You can reach out to Ina at info@divineu.ca. And I'm Martin Comtois, and spirit of the times 108 at gmail.com. These videos and this channel that we do, it's supported by the readings we get. And so if you want some support and understanding and you want to integrate the process of individuation in your own life, reach out. We're here to support you. Again, Ina, I can't express my gratitude enough for your willingness to and your courage in wanting to do this with me. Thank you.
Absolutely. Gently down the stream.
Life is but a dream.
Amen.
Whoop, 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 whoop.